Colleagues, the election for Deputy General Secretary comes at a critical time for educators right across the Union, not least in Wales. Over the last year, a year of pandemic, educators have turned to their union for support. And we showed that when we act together, we can make even Prime Ministers think again. But we're going to need to build that strength much deeper and wider if we are to protect educators and education. Because we face a Westminster government that intends to make us pay for the costs of the COVID crisis. Their austerity policies will lead to more child poverty, more inequality, and so more needs for educators to try and meet. But instead of implementing our vision of genuinely comprehensive, fully funded, democratically accountable education, we face further cuts and threats to the working conditions of staff and to the learning conditions of our students. Faced with such threats, we need as strong a leadership as possible, and the newly elected DGS will have a vital role to play in that leadership. I and those who have asked me to stand believe that I have demonstrated throughout my many years of activity within the NUT and now the NEU that I have the skills, experience and commitment to best provide that lead. For those who don't know me, I was local secretary and joint union secretary in Lewisham in South London for over 20 years. I was elected and re-elected to the NUT National Executive and then appointed London Regional Secretary in 2016, showing in practice how I could bring together staff teams in the transition to the new union as a senior manager and successfully lead both staff and activists, bringing together them in the new union and rebuilding district teams of reps and officers, mapping strengths and weaknesses, finding new reps, further involving and training long-standing ones. I'm now a caseworker and president of my new district in Lancaster and Morecambe, a supply teacher helping build the supply network and strengthening national advice and using my skills throughout the pandemic to warn on national radio and television to members and governors why COVID would inevitably be transferred in schools. So I want to give you a firm commitment that in electing me, you'll have a DGS that understands and is able to give voice to our vision and our demands to members, parents, politicians and the press. A DGS who listens and then takes account of different points of view, and who has the confidence and independence to speak out at senior level if I believe a different perspective needs to be raised, and a DGS who understands the details of casework and policy and can work with both staff teams and lay officers and reps to develop successful campaigns and to build members' confidence to take the action that we need to do together. But you're going to want to know, as members in Wales, am I a DGS who understands the context facing education there? Well, Wales is literally the land of my fathers, but the fact that education decisions are devolved in Wales, I think gives a particular opportunity that perhaps isn't open in the same way in England. And for example, the work done by the union and its supply activists showed how pressure led to gains on an all-Wales basis with the new framework agreement for supply teachers. But of course, those gains have been limited while agencies continue to ignore those pay rates. And the battle continues to win the direct employment of supply teachers paid to according to the school teachers' pay and conditions and as part of the teachers' pension scheme. But as well as that continued campaign for supply colleagues, I'd want to discuss with you whether a campaign could be fought to win a national contract for Wales for all education staff. Now, I've long argued that the NEU should bring together all the key concerns around pay, around working hours and education into one unified campaign for such a new national contract for all. But as was achieved in some local authorities through winning workload charters, while building such a campaign on a union-wide basis, we should also look to make campaign gains through individual employers and through putting pressure on the Welsh Government across Wales. Because in England and Wales, the paragraph numbers may be slightly different, but teachers' conditions are equally undermined by the unlimited, essentially, requirement for the teacher to work such reasonable hours as may be necessary to enable the effective discharge of the teacher's professional duties. And I believe we've got to organise to win an overall limit on working hours, not just directed time, as well as to ensure, of course, that support staff are paid properly and not expected to work outside their contracted duties and hours too. We also need to win trade union negotiated staff and class size policies to ensure there is enough staffing to meet needs, to protect both jobs and education. Now, such a campaign would be a major undertaking, but I think that it's one that would be widely felt and deeply felt and start to engage the many members who perhaps yet are not involved in the activity of the union. And as DGS, I would use all my experience and commitment to help staff and districts in NEU Cymru develop such a campaign. But of course in Wales, you have managed to avoid the breakup of so much education into academy chains that has afflicted so much damage in England. And you've also, aided by the union, won curriculum changes that at least move closer to putting the needs of children and educational expertise first, rather than the narrowing of the curriculum that we've seen enforced by SATs in England. And of course, the contradictions remain. Whereas Estin may be looking for creativity and active learning, the pressures remain on staff to show pupil progress. And we've got to continue to push for an end to the national reading and numeracy assessments, and for a full review of our exam system. And just as in England, colleagues may worry whether a more progressive approach to curriculum could mean more workload for staff, your members will know that for change to be implemented properly, it requires time for training and curriculum development and funding to make sure there's both sufficient staffing and resources to meet needs. And sadly, of course, under ongoing budget pressures, there's the risk that the opportunities from a new curriculum are lost and educators expected to implement change on the cheap. There's even the risk of schools using the move to new areas of learning as an excuse to cut posts, as well as the ongoing threat, of course, to rural schools. And as we've seen in England already, additional learning needs reforms can also too easily lead to workload being pushed down onto staff in schools and funding for needs not being met. And therefore I'd finish by saying that the issue of education funding remains an absolutely key one, particularly in Wales. The Westminster government announcement of recovery expenditure of just £50 per pupil is clear evidence that they have no intention of properly investing in children's futures. In Wales, as you know, as the block grant to Wales has fallen, so has education spending fallen by 6% in real terms. And there is good reason to fear that Westminster will seek to cut spending yet further. And therefore NEU Cymru, alongside the whole of the NEU, is going to need to organise to expose the cuts and the unmet needs of our learners and build a united campaign to demand the funding that's needed, using all the methods at our disposal: stalls, meetings, demonstrations, lobbying of politicians, and also the action that we all need to take together as well. If we can have that kind of a campaign, then we can really organise together to really change lives, both the lives of our members and educators and of the students that we teach as well. That's the kind of leadership that I want to support and that I believe that I can bring to the union as its newly elected Deputy General Secretary. Please support me and please support my campaign. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.